Hello everyone and welcome to this session. My name, if you don't know, is Dr Ranj. I'm a practicing NHS paediatrician. I'm also an ambassador for the charity Best Beginnings, who've been quite heavily involved alongside Homestart UK and the Parent Infant Foundation in the Babies in Lockdown report. You may have heard stuff about that this week. In fact, it was trending on Twitter at some point, so you should have heard about it. What this report shows, quite importantly and quite sadly, I suppose, in a way, is that the experiences of those children and their families were far from what they should have been. So we're all here. I'm joined by some amazing representatives across those three organisations. We're all here to discuss the realities of having a baby in lockdown and have a deeper dive into that hashtag Babies in Lockdown report. And you can go online, check out that hashtag. It'll have a link to the report somewhere as well if you want to find out more. So on quickly to some introductions, because I have a habit of chatting and I'm going to let other people do it this time around. First and foremost, we've got Agnes. Do you want to have a...
Well, I'm a little chatterbox too, so you're in safe hands there. So my name is Agnes Agyepong and I am the Parent Engagement Programme Manager at Best Beginnings.
And next up we've got Peter Grigg.
Hi, I'm Peter Grigg. I'm the Chief Exec of Homestart UK, and Homestart is a network of organisations providing volunteer support to families. It's lovely to be here.
Thank you both for joining us. Last but not least, we've got Sally.
Hi, I'm Sally Hogg from the Parent Infant Foundation. I'm one of the authors of the report. And the Parent Infant Foundation is a charity that supports services and campaigns for babies' wellbeing, and particularly babies' emotional wellbeing, and their parents and their relationship with their parents.
Well, thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and thank you for all of the amazing work you already do anyway. So let's dive straight into this report. A lot of people will want to know what actually has the reality been of having a baby during lockdown, and what are the stories that have come out of this report? I'll throw it to you, Agnes.
Yeah, well, I think when we're looking at the stories, of course, there's not a one-size-fits-all. Families and parents and mothers have been impacted differently across the UK. But what we have found is that the experience has been completely disproportionate. So in some areas, it's been fantastic and people have really enjoyed actually being able to stay at home longer and have the support from their partners. And that's been an amazing experience for them. And that's fantastic. That's what we would want to hear. But in those areas and in those communities that have already been disproportionately impacted by services even before COVID, those communities and those families have really felt the brunt of this pandemic.
So what sorts of families are we talking about when we talk about people that have been disproportionately affected?
Yeah, we're talking about families from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. We're talking about families and parents from particularly the Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. We're talking about, of course, fathers, a lot of fathers and partners who were not able, as we all know, allowed to come into the delivery rooms and the appointments. So it's a mixture. And obviously some of those reasons are understandable, but nevertheless, there has been an impact because of that.
Yeah. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about how Black and minority ethnic groups have been disproportionately affected across the board for various things. What I suppose from my perspective, and a lot of people that may be watching at home, they might want to know, why is that? Why does that happen? Do you have any ideas around why that might be?
Well, I mean, for me, I'm not actually surprised. I mean, if we're looking at, for example, pregnant women and how they were impacted, and I'm talking now in particular to Black pregnant women, and how they were impacted disproportionately during this pandemic. And I say this because I think at around 55% of pregnant women that were admitted to hospital with COVID, they were from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background. But if we look at pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, Black women were already 5 times more likely to die. So it seems that a lot of the inequalities that we're seeing or that are being exposed during this pandemic, they already existed, and now there's kind of been like a spotlight shined on these existing inequalities.
So what you're saying is that these groups already had a disadvantage.
We've already been disproportionately impacted. I mean, there's a massive campaign, which you probably all know about, the 5 Times More campaign. This was going on before COVID, shining a spotlight on Black women and their experiences in maternity services. Interestingly enough, we were told that pregnant women are no more likely to be impacted by COVID within the pandemic. However, we know that was different for Black women. So when we look at it like that, then we know that actually this is sitting on existing inequalities.
Yeah. And you highlighted Black and minority ethnic groups there, also young parents, lower socioeconomic backgrounds. These were all groups that came out in this report as being particularly vulnerable. And Sally, that's kind of part of the basis, I guess, for what this report is asking for. It's made a few proposals, hasn't it, as to how we can address this, and it's taken that into consideration.
Yeah, so what we're arguing in the report is that although this has obviously been a really extreme and unique situation, that actually, kind of as Agnes was saying, there were problems that existed before COVID. Our services were really depleted by years and years of underinvestment. And there were inequalities. Child poverty is rising in this country. As Agnes was saying, there are inequalities affecting Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. So our solutions that we propose in the report are around kind of long-term sustained change to really tackle those underlying issues, so that not only do we recover from the pandemic, but we are in a better place generally to give our babies the best start in life, and also that services are kind of better able to weather any future storms. So we've got 3 asks in the report. One of them we're calling a baby boost, and that is a kind of very COVID specific, a kind of immediate injection of funding into the system to help these families right now with their specific problems they face. So just as we've seen kind of money go in to schools to help with catch up, to get our high streets and our restaurants back on the road, we're saying, well, actually, babies are really important too, and they need that kind of catch up fund. So that's the baby boost idea. Okay. We're saying that there needs to be an investment of core funding into services, because actually they're all so depleted that they're not able to work well, even at the best of times, and let alone in a global pandemic. And then our other recommendation is quite an exciting new one, which is about a parent-infant premium. And this is based on something that government already does called a pupil premium, which is extra money that it gives to schools specifically to help disadvantaged kids to achieve the best they can. And what we're saying is that actually all of the science tells us that kids don't start falling behind once they get to school age. It's about what happens in their background, their community, their family. Some kids are born, sadly, at a disadvantage, and we need to help their parents and their communities to give them a best start in life from the start. So the parent-infant premium is about giving extra money to local commissioners so that they can give families the support they need so that all babies have the best start. So you might want to really bolster health visiting, and also maybe put some money back into children's centres, or provide some really specialist intensive provision for families where there's quite a lot of trauma and difficulty. And it could be used in different ways, depending on any conversation with communities and families about what they feel that their children really need.
How much money are we talking? Because people are always going to ask. Great, you've suggested all these wonderful initiatives, which is fantastic, but everything costs money. And at the moment, a lot of people would feel like there's not a great deal of money floating about, is there?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, these are difficult times. So the baby boost is 55 million. That is less than's been spent on getting our high streets back up and running. It's the same amount per child as the money that's gone to school-age children. So yes, it's a big amount of money, but actually in the context of all of the money that government has spent on this pandemic, and the millions and billions that have been spent on furloughing people, for example, it's really a drop in the ocean. So if government can afford it for everybody else, then it can afford it for babies. The parent infant premium is £1,000 per disadvantaged for baby fit from a disadvantaged family. And again, that is a match of what the pupil premium is. So our argument really is one of equality. It's saying older kids are getting this money. Why aren't the youngest? Because actually the evidence shows us that it's when kids are little where money from the state can actually have its most difference. That kind of prevention it's not only better than cure and more ethical, it's actually cheaper. So, the money should be put into the younger kids. And at the moment, all the money is going into older children. And we're just arguing that babies need it as well. And so all of these pots of money, that the COVID specific ones and the longer term pupil premium should all be stretched so that they exist for all children from birth or from pregnancy all the way up.
And that's on top of the proposal where we're asking the government to fund these services in the longer term, make a bit more of a commitment to invest properly so that we don't necessarily have to have these discussions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we shouldn't be talking about, kids getting to school without kind of the basic skills they need to learn, or kids being kind of excluded from school or even from childcare, with 3 and 4. Those we shouldn't be having to spend money, but also those kids shouldn't be left in that position. We can do stuff with families earlier and give kids a good start rather than picking up pieces. And that's our argument generally in all 3 charities. That's kind of why we exist.
Because a lot of people will be asking, why this cause? Like, why should we be channeling money in this direction? What's the big deal when there are so many other services? For example, cancers are getting missed. Other services of mental health, for instance, for everybody else is under huge pressure. Why is it so important that we pay the right attention to this group of people?
Yes, of course we need to be tackling obesity and cancer now, but if we invest in the children of today, then we shouldn't have such a kind of burden of those diseases in 20, 30, 40 years' time. I want us to have a generation of children who are actually far more resilient and robust and healthier, so we don't have all of those long-term health conditions or to the same prevalence as we currently do. We can make this a lot better.
Yeah, I remember someone used the term build back better, I think.
Yeah.
Which is a lovely thing to say. And I'm going to go back to the report actually for a second and back to Agnes. You mentioned one of the themes that came out was how partners weren't able to be with their delivering partners during labour and things like that. That was one of the things that came out in the pandemic. We know that was really, really difficult for a lot of people. There were various other themes as well, though, weren't there, that people were reporting?
There was a variety of different themes, and the report is one part, but behind these reports, we have to remember these are people's stories, and these are, their lives. There was a lady that I spoke with, and she, gave birth, and her partner had to leave 45 minutes afterwards. Fortunately, he was able to make it, but she, had quite a lot of stitches, and she was in pain. So for 2 days, she didn't get to have the support that she needed. Understandably, we understand why partners were not allowed. But while she was in hospital, she wasn't also able to get the care that she felt she deserved, because the midwives also needed to keep their kind of social distancing, So there she was, being told, oh, you can't do anything strenuous and you can't, bend down and so forth. But yet she wasn't given the adequate support within the hospital to support her within that. So she was there, for an example, when she left the ward, she had to pull her suitcase and all her belongings, and everybody was there watching her, and she had these stitches in place, and as she's walking, she's in immense pain, and so yes, on a theoretical and even on a practical level, there is an understanding as to why we do want to stop the spread of COVID and so forth. Of course we do, but then it's like, how do we navigate that space at the same time managing the very real needs of women who are in the hospital, who genuinely need help and support, and their lives depend on it?
Yeah. I think it's one of the risks we run during a pandemic is that you become so blinkered and focused on the pandemic.
Yeah.
You forget all of the other things that are important as well. And we knew that pregnant women weren't at any increased risk.
Yeah.
We knew that children aren't really making up large numbers of people that suffer from COVID. And yet because of blanket policies and the way they've been applied, they've been even more disadvantaged
Exactly.
than they would do, when actually the risk to them may not be that great.
Exactly, and it's a one-size-fits-all. And where I've really been shocked, and I'm talking about this on a personal level, I'm a mum myself, I've got young children, so I speak to a lot of mums on a personal capacity, is the postnatal support. So yes, at least there has been talks from the government and from different bodies in regards to pregnant women. But then what happens when you have the baby? A lot of women, their babies have not seen a health visitor literally throughout the pandemic. There's women who have, as I said, had immense stitches and operations, and they're being told and asked to send pictures of intimate areas, these stitches are in intimate areas, and send that in to the doctors, which already compounds any trauma that they already have. They're being, in terms of, mental health support, they're not really sure where to access that, lack of health visiting. There's so many different strains to this. And so postnatally, I know you was asking earlier about themes, but I think that's an area that we really need to look at. And just like I mentioned earlier in regards to the inequalities within Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities, what we also know is prior to this pandemic, there's been so much literature and reports out there in regards to how our postnatal care is not adequate. It wasn't up to scratch before the pandemic. So what we're seeing again is that when these storms come, is that if a ship is not stable prior to the storm, then we're already exposed when a storm happens, and we're seeing that definitely postnatally.
Exactly, and this report has definitely highlighted some of those pre-existing concerns, and actually worryingly showed that things have got worse in some instances. Some of the other themes that came through were, as you mentioned, difficult birth experiences, difficulty in breastfeeding support, which you all know can be quite patchy as it is, and is hugely important. Partners not being part of the pregnancy journey. You mentioned digital appointments, which on the surface seem like a great idea in a pandemic when you have to be physically distanced, but when it comes to actual practicalities involving people, it can pose some quite worrying challenges as well.
Exactly. There was a lady that gave birth and she did not see her health visitor until day 5, and she was having real problems breastfeeding. And by the time she in the end, she had to resort to a syringe. She's a first-time mum, a young mum. And so by the time she did see the midwife day 5, the baby was dehydrated, So it's not a matter of women just kind of complaining and feeling like, woe is me. I see a lot of that out there. These are babies who are turning up at appointments quite severely dehydrated on day 5, when normally they would have seen a health visitor. I think it's day 1 and then day 3 and so forth. So these things would have been picked up early on.
Yeah, I can definitely vouch for that. I work in children's A&E, and every shift I do, I see at least 1 or 2 families with feeding issues. Usually quite straightforward feeding issues, and they just need support. They don't need to be in A&E. They shouldn't be in A&E, but they've ended up there because there isn't anything else out there for them, because the normal channels that they would access aren't available.
Exactly. And you also spoke about, you also spoke about digital. What I found as well is that digital support is not across the board. It's some sort of yes, there is digital support, but it's not equal. So you get some areas and some communities where it's more kind of structured and standardized, and maybe they're getting support day 2 and then day 5 and so forth. And then you get some communities where they're literally seeing a health visitor on day 5, and then they're not getting any further support. And I think these are some of the themes that we not only have we seen in the report, but if we do not fix that kind of postcode lottery in regards to how services are applied, it's going to result in a lot of structural and generational problems further on down the line. And that's why we're really calling for that support now, to be able to level that out so that everybody is getting the same good standardized care that they can possibly get within such a pandemic.
Yeah, and that's why those 3 proposals that Sally outlined there were so important. One of the themes you just mentioned, which is hugely important, and I don't want to neglect, is mental health, perinatal mental health. And that's one thing that came through in this report. And Peter, I want to bring you in here. there will be lots of expectant parents or new parents that are listening to this and may be quite worried. They may be going through some of their own mental health problems right now. There may be new issues that have arisen during the pandemic. What advice would you give to them with regards to their mental health or the health of their baby?
Yeah, I think the report clearly shows that obviously parents are anxious about COVID. I think that is, the whole world is anxious about COVID, but there's a particular anxiety that comes with, parents who are expecting babies and new babies, households with tiny children in their potentially first time parents. And, that I think it's true to say that the needs of those parents and the needs of babies have been totally forgotten during this pandemic response. Very rarely do you hear anything being mentioned about babies, and it sort of feels like they've just been left to it, sort of left to look after themselves. At Home Start, we would typically, our volunteers would be able to get out there and home visit, and obviously you can't home visit when you're socially distancing. And so some of those early signs of mental health issues that might be there and prevalent in mothers, in fathers, and in the more general household, you could normally try and help by spotting the signs early if you're alongside, but obviously in these times it's been difficult to do that. And at the best of times, I think parents are find it quite difficult to raise their hand and say they need help. We have this sort of expectation that we've all got to do it on our own, and it's a parenting issue. You just got to work your way through it. But actually, the more we learn about mental health issues, the more we know that actually asking for help is the first point, isn't it? It's the first thing you can do, is just recognize that there is a tremendous amount of stress and anxiety in being pregnant and expecting children and having children. That's there anyway, and it's very inevitable that a parent, a mother in particular, will feel that in their own mental health. So the first thing is to ask for help, recognize that there are stresses and strains on you as a person, and you need to ask for help. And I hope that for most parents there will be somebody around them, a friend or family member, that can help. Obviously, in these strange times, they may not always be in the same room, but I think the first thing to do is ask for help, and then from there you've got some more specialist services that can provide that support. So whether it's an app like Baby Buddy, it has lots of tips and things that you can look at. If it's an organisation like Home Start, we provide volunteer support by digital means at the moment, but hopefully not forever, by digital means exclusively. So reach out for help, and if it's obviously more serious than that, and if there are sort of any concerns, then of course there are helplines. Childline is one if there's an issue with children, and Samaritans if there are more serious mental health concerns for adults. But there are sources of help. There's lots of good help online. But I think the first thing to recognise is this is a very natural time in a parent's life where there will be mental health stresses and strains. And, just to ask for help is not a weakness. In fact, it's a strength. And we'd encourage everyone to do that. And I think what the report shows is that, it's not the COVID period has not only been bad. There have been parents who reported some, enjoyment, having some time together and maybe having partners at home for a bit longer, and maybe some of the stresses of the world are not quite the same as they have been.
Peace and quiet from everybody else.
Well, it's not entirely bad, a picture of and there are services and the NHS, community midwives, health visitors, doctors, volunteers who've gone to great lengths to try and help families. So there have been such tremendous heroes in this period. But we do know, the themes that Agnes and Sally have already drawn upon. We know that the world was unequal before COVID. We know the experience of COVID has been unequal, and we know that the recovery period is going to be unequal. And so it's really important we get out there proactively to find and spot those early signs of mental health and other, effects of the trauma and adversity that may have been experienced during this period. And we need to do something about it now, which I hope some of our policy calls might help us do.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Actually, it sounds all doom and gloom when we're talking about it here, but there have been some positives that have been highlighted in this report. And the classic example being left alone to get on with your baby and to actually bond with your baby, not have to contend with hundreds and hundreds of visitors. Coming from a minority ethnic background, I know what that's like. You can't keep people away.
Me too.
So you want to, and it gives you the perfect excuse. So it's not all been doom and gloom, but possibly the downside of it is that the support that people really do need, sadly, hasn't been there for them.
I think that's right. And, you know, we can build back better. I think we can be optimistic about the future. We don't have to sign up to the idea that it's always going to be bad, but we must recognise there is a shadow that has been, that will follow this pandemic. There's a shadow on people who have experienced trauma and have experienced adversity. And we need to really work hard to pick up those pieces. But as Sally and Agnes have both said, we can build back better. We can build services that are more sustainable, that target the more disadvantaged communities in different ways, and actually just give that boost to babies who've been born in this period, so we can avoid the idea that in 30 years' time we're talking about the COVID generation that was entirely a lost generation. And the time to act is now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned some of the places that people can go for help. There are lots and lots of helplines. There are lots of charities. There's lots of online spaces that people can go. If you're able to access face-to-face support, that's fantastic. The Baby Buddy app, which Best Beginnings has created, has a built-in 24/7 Baby Buddy crisis messenger for parents in emotional distress, so you can use that. And as I always say, the NHS is open 24/7 for everything, whether it's COVID-related or not, especially for mental health concerns. So there is always someone there as a backup. Now, before we kind of finish up, I guess I'm going to ask each of you just if you could give out one message from this report, what would it be? What would be your take home for anybody that's listening to this and hasn't had a chance to read it yet? What's the one thing you want them to remember? I'm going to start with Agnes.
Well, I think for me, it's that, look, the report has highlighted existing inequalities. But just like what Peter said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are services that are there to help, even within the pandemic. And I think a lot of the times people are feeling really kind of scared to reach out and talk to people because they think that everything is shut down. But in fact, you know, we are still on board to help. You know, we've got the Baby Buddy app, you know, Home Start Parent Infant Foundation. We're all here to still help.
Fabulous. And Sally, what would be your take home?
Well, I was going to say something very similar to Agnes. I mean, I think it's the fact that this has shone a light on inequality. So there's been this idea that kind of, you know, COVID has been a leveller because it's hit everybody, but actually we might have all been in the same storm, but we've been in very different boats, I think. And
it's brilliant. So
yeah, but it's not inevitable. So that feeling of kind of doom and gloom must go away, and we can all take action from this. So I don't want any mum to read this report and think, well, that means there's no support there for me, because as you say, the NHS is there 24/7. There are some wonderful health visitors and midwives, albeit in services that are underfunded and depleted. So I want mums and dads to read this and know that there is help there. I want all of those wonderful people who came out and volunteered and helped their neighbours during COVID to remember that they can still help their neighbours, and that their mum on the street with a little baby, you know, they can reach out and support them. And I want all of us to be kind of active citizens who can campaign for change on this. Because unless government is hearing that we as voters and the population care, they're not going to start caring. So we all need to take something from this and be active, but be positive about it.
Everyone's definitely got a part to play. And Peter, what would be your final words of wisdom?
Oh dear. Well, I think Agnes and Sally have said so much wise words already. So the thing that shines out for me on top of what they've already said is the resilience that's come through. I mean, the resilience of parents in such difficult circumstances is remarkable. The way that these sort of parents make it work and have made it work in tough times. The resilience of communities when all the support services are sort of understandably withdrawn and rolled back. It's communities have stepped up and helped out, and I think it's that resilience that gives me hope that actually it's not been fair, it's not been equal, it's not been right that all these support services and all the maternity leave was meant to be a fun experience, not one of grief and loss and anxiety. You know, this is meant to have been a really special time for parents, and so you know we know that there's a lot of grief, there's loss, there's anxiety that is yet to come, but the resilience that we've seen in parents and families and communities, I think, is there to be invested in now, and really to make as sustainable as possible into the future, with hopefully with some investment around that to make that work. And I think with all that in mind, we can build back better, and we can build a society that doesn't forget babies. And let's hope that second waves and third waves and fourth waves and anything else isn't part of our new normal. But if they are, and if we do have to cope with something like this again, let's remember babies, and let's make this a better experience for new and expectant parents in the future.
Exactly. That's absolutely what I was thinking. I was like, well, this pandemic has been pants, for want of a better word, for lots of people. Call it a pandemic. And let's not forget the most vulnerable in society. And whilst we've asked governments and the authorities and the powers that be to do something a bit more concrete and a bit more structured and, put funding and services in place, there is still stuff that we all as a community, as society, as people can do, little things to help out each other. And those things really, really do count. And on that word, I am going to thank you all so much for joining this conversation. Agnes from Best Beginnings, Sally from Parent Infant Foundation, and Peter from Home Start UK. Thank you for being a part of this report and making it happen. And thank you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you to everyone that's been watching. Remember, we want to hear your views as well. So you can go online. If you search for the hashtag babies in lockdown, or go to the websites of any of these organisations, you can find out a bit more about this report. But you can also let us know on social media what you think using hashtag babies in lockdown. And we'd love to hear your comments and your thoughts on that. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day and rest of your week, depending on when you're watching this. And don't forget about the babies. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranj. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.